Hey everybody, welcome back to another video. As promised in my last video, Reflections on Guns, Germs, and Steel, I'm making a second video on the book where I'm going to dive into some of the ideas I think Jared Diamond did not go into enough, and also how many of the ideas in the book can be applied to speculation about where humanity is headed in the future. But in my last video, I also reflected on a few criticisms of the book. You can watch my last video to hear exactly what I had to say. But my main criticism of the book is that it was very Eurocentric. By explaining why Europeans, and not their colonial subjects, were the ones to wield more power from the natural conditions of the world, it's almost framed as a justification for the horrors of colonization. And even though that was not Diamond's intention, the framing of the book is one of its biggest drawbacks. If the book was centered more generally on how geography shaped human civilizations, not just how geography allowed Europeans to conquer the world, it would be a stronger argument. And I think with this book, it's very important to also hear the criticisms, because the ideas presented are difficult to scientifically prove or disprove, and you need to have a fuller picture of things to have a good analysis. Regardless, the book sparks a lot of interesting debates on the fundamental questions of history, like how do ideas shape history, or how much power do societies have over how geography dictates their fates. But I wanted to begin this video by looking at one criticism in particular. In a journal article I recently read titled "Geography is Not Destiny," a quantitative test of Diamond's axis of orientation hypothesis. The authors test Diamond's claim that Eurasia's east-west orientation gave it an advantage in spreading crops, farming practices, and technologies. The results show that the orientation of the continents had little measurable effect on this diffusion. Instead, they argue that cultural and societal factors were more important in shaping how farming spread across regions. It's a compelling argument, but the article itself acknowledges its own limits. It does not examine how an abundance of domesticatable plants and animals contributed to Eurasia's long-term success in building powerful civilizations. And that's important, because the axis of orientation idea is only one of several arguments Diamond presents in his book. I agree that the biggest factor that helped Europeans colonize the world was not the layout of the continents. It was their resistance to germs, something they developed through close contact with domesticated animals. Still, the article raises an interesting question. Even if cultural choices mattered more than geography in how farming developed, how much is culture itself indirectly shaped by geography? For example, if Eurasians adopted farming early on because of cultural decisions, were those decisions influenced by the abundance of plants and animals available to them in the first place? Taking this idea further, even if the east-west orientation of Eurasia did not directly give it an early advantage, could the very presence of that orientation have shaped culture in more subtle ways? Did the daily rhythm of the sun rising in the east and setting in the west, in tangent with the shape of Eurasia, encourage societies to imagine expansion and movement along that axis? I'm not trying to prove this idea here, but I think it's worth considering that geography can still shape civilizations in indirect, cultural ways, even if its influence is not as straightforward as Diamond described. I've often described the movement of Western civilization along this axis as a kind of springboard, from the Fertile Crescent to the Mediterranean, then to Northern Europe, and eventually to North America. The center of power seems to have shifted again and again towards regions with more advantageous geography. And if the movement of the sun influenced the course of civilizations, how about the moon? How did its constant presence in the sky shape our myths, our science, and even our desire to explore the cosmos? If the moon had not served as a nightly reminder that other worlds exist, would humanity have speculated as much about what lies beyond Earth? In many ways, the moon itself is a natural springboard towards planets like Mars, and eventually to more distant places like Proxima Centauri, or even the Andromeda Galaxy, which is slowly drifting towards the Milky Way. Just as Earth's geography favored the expansion of Western civilization, perhaps our position in space will dictate the success of future spacefaring civilizations. Our placement in the habitable zone, the stabilizing influence of the moon, and even the protective shield of the outer gas giants may have been crucial for life to flourish here. The question is, will similar cosmic factors continue to favor our existence as we carry civilization into the universe? Another fascinating point for further speculation in Diamond's book is how farming fundamentally altered the course of humanity. Agriculture created food surpluses, which allowed for specialized labor and eventually led to writing, cities, and innovation. Yet, for all of its importance, farming is a relatively recent development. Humans lived as hunter-gatherers for roughly 95% of our history. For better or worse, farming stands as the greatest milestone in shaping civilization. Since then, work has defined our identities as individuals. But by many measures, humans were happier and healthier as hunter-gatherers. Less disease, fewer choices to overwhelm us, and less work overall. And now, we may be approaching another turning point, where those natural rhythms could return in a new form, through the advent of artificial intelligence. AI represents the culmination of recorded human knowledge, which began in the wake of agriculture. For the first time, we have a technology that could free us from work as the defining feature of our existence. Coupled with globalization and the growing accessibility of space travel, the future may open the door to a new kind of nomadic life among the stars, one that echoes our hunter-gatherer past, but at a far higher level. Seen this way, farming was the start of a roughly 10,000-year transition, from scattered bands of foragers to a globalized species on the cusp of artificial general intelligence and advanced spacefaring. If AI truly ushers in the final stage of this long cycle, it may mark both an ending and a beginning. The end of the cycle that began with our emergence as a species, and the start of a new cycle where humanity carries its nomadic spirit into the cosmos. Future civilizations across the galaxy may one day look back on us in the same way that we look back on our earliest ancestors. In many respects, life within civilization on Earth has been a kind of captivity, a break from our natural nomadic rhythms. Space, however, may offer the chance to reclaim those roots. Beyond Earth, humanity could rediscover the freedom of movement and exploration that defined us for most of our existence. Another idea in Diamond's book that made me reflect on our contemporary world is his description of how geography doomed the native peoples of the Americas. If geography sealed their fate, could it also shape the destiny of the United States today? North and South America's isolation made them vulnerable to conquest, but also meant that the land was settled rapidly by the newcomers. Because of this, many towns and cities, especially in the United States, developed in isolation from one another. The rural-urban divide we see today may in part be a legacy of that geographic weakness. And it raises a troubling question. Could America's cultural wars prove as destructive to our cohesion as European diseases once were to the indigenous populations? Could our internal divisions hurt the people of the Americas in the same way that external isolation once did? One can only speculate. And the final thought I want to share in this video is about how we judge the past. People today often look back with severe condemnation, but I think much of that judgment comes from cultural differences rather than clear moral superiority. There's no question that Europeans committed genocide against the peoples of the Americas, but as much as we like to believe that we have moved beyond such brutality, I suspect people in the future will look back on us with the same contempt. Take climate change, for example. The consequences of carbon emissions fall disproportionately on the global south. Rising sea levels and extreme heat will render parts of the world uninhabitable long before Europe and North America feel the full impact. And yet, we continue to live lifestyles that increase our carbon footprint every year. Even the electricity powering this very YouTube video contributes in some small way to suffering and death elsewhere in the world. And beyond how we treat other humans, the future will almost certainly judge our treatment of animals in much the same way we judge human slavery of the past. Industrial farming is, at its core, an inhumane practice. And as someone who eats meat, I don't say this from any moral high ground. But the reality is that meat production also carries a far greater carbon footprint than plant-based food. From an energy perspective alone, a vegetarian diet makes far more sense, especially if we imagine future humans living and traveling in space. With the rise of lab-grown meat, the practical need to kill animals for food may disappear entirely. Once eating animals is viewed as a primitive act, the cruelty of it will likely stand out in stark relief. Jared Diamond emphasized in Guns, Germs, and Steel that the domestication of animals gave early civilizations an enormous advantage. But in the future, those benefits may fade, leaving behind only the moral cost. And my purpose here isn't to justify the evils of colonization by comparing them to our own flaws, nor to make a case for animal activism. Rather, it is to highlight how our moral standards are deeply shaped by culture, and how what seems acceptable today can just as easily be judged as evil tomorrow. Looking at our treatment of animals also brings us full circle to where this 10,000-year transition began, in the advent of farming. Agriculture gave us stability and predictability, but also scaled human brutality to an industrial level. Where nomadic hunter-gatherers once fought with rocks and spears, we now live under the shadow of nuclear weapons capable of erasing our species entirely. Modern liberalism has always imagined a future better than the past. Though we still face many institutionalized immoral practices, we've generally undone segregation, abolished slavery, And perhaps one day we will move beyond capitalism itself. But if history is a process of confronting and correcting our evils, will we eventually be forced to confront the flaws of our species as a whole? With the rise of artificial intelligence, it's not hard to imagine a future where humans are ultimately seen as the problem. Just as we now judge our earlier ways of life as primitive, could AI and robotics emerge from us the same way we emerge from nature, carrying civilization into a new evolutionary phase? And if we keep asking questions, eventually we reach the most fundamental ones of all. What is life? What is reality? What is our purpose? What, in the end, is anything at all? Until next time, be sure to subscribe, and we'll see you in the next video.